there. Really, I want to welcome all participants. Before we start, I'm those of you, the PRs in New York and the members of missions. We've got some good news for some hope from Martin on the Martin side. I must say that I just want us to have some thoughts for him this morning in the continuation. It's more than 3 weeks under events later. This is quite the fight for his life, and it saddens all of us. But on the other hand, I think we have to help his family with our hopes and our hope and prayer and good thoughts, and that's the only thing I think we can do at the moment. So I wanted to say that. I have thanks for joining us this meeting on Western Africa, and I just have to want to say that we will be opening the speakers list after the briefers. So please use the chat window to request the floor for those of you after we've had the presentations by our two briefers this morning. So I'm pleased to welcome you to this meeting with a focus on the impact of the pandemic on peace building developments in Western Africa and the Sahel. We are very pleased that we're able to build on the previous PBC discussions on COVID-19. We had a first meeting 2 weeks ago, and last week's meeting on Liberia Confederation chaired by Sweden. And there's a strong consensus within the PBC that this body has a vital role to play in supporting coherent, coordinated, and conflict-sensitive multilateral responses to the pandemic. At the same time as this pandemic is fueling instability and unrest, the PBC must help marshal even stronger international support to national peace-building efforts than I think ever before. We are pleased to have with us today, as we've just welcomed him, and we all love you, Dr. Chambers, and we all think so highly of you. So it's a pleasure for all of us to have you this morning with us. You all know Dr. Chambers, who will shed light on the impact that COVID-19 is having on the region, where the PBC to its country-specific and regional work has had the longest engagement. So it was for us normal to start with you, Dr. Chambers, and with the region of Western Africa, and to go deeper and understand what's at play in the region. And we really look forward to your words. And we will ask after that Oscar, the Assistant Secretary General, Oscar Fernandez Taranco, who also has been very active and helped support the conflict-sensitive response by the UN in this region. And so Oscar will brief us. And we had asked the Ambassador Cohn, the permanent observer from ECOWAS, who is unable to join us this morning for the meeting. So he had the personal engagement, he couldn't postpone. So so unfortunately we won't have him, but what I've done is I've used my privilege of the chair of the PBC to ask our friend Leone, Adam, the ambassador of Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, to be the first speaker to give us some comments at first. And I'll also give priorities to some other colleagues from the region to speak as first commenters from the PR. So if anyone wants to join Leon after that, you're more than welcome. Just we'll try to manage this, but and do as much as we can. But I think it's important to hear the voices from the region and the perspective of the region before we all jump in. So thank you very much. So I'm without further ado, we all know the SRSG for ECOWAS, for West Africa and the Sahel. Dr. Chambers, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your warm words of introduction and welcome. And I'm also very, very pleased to join you, Mr. Ambassador, your colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, my good friend Oscar. It is a pleasure once again to interact with you in furtherance to our mutual commitment to sustainable peace and stability in West Africa and the Sahel. I should say that your meeting is timely because tomorrow the ECOWAS heads of states will also be holding a video conference on the impact of COVID-19 in the region. As unfortunate as it is that this exchange is happening at a time when the global community is grappling with COVID-19 pandemic and its disastrous effects on the lives of billions of people worldwide, including the millions in West Africa and the Sahel. I do hope you and your loved ones are keeping safe and healthy. Just like the rest of the world, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic in West Africa and the Sahel is multidimensional. While it is primarily an acute health crisis with considerable effects on the already weak systems in the region, it also has significant ramifications on the socio-economic life of the people, with additional implications for peace and stability. If this is overwhelming to rich, strong, and well-developed countries, we can only imagine the extent of disruption it has caused and is going to cause even more to countries in this region with hitherto we're already struggling to address the myriad of development, governance, and security challenges. As Secretary General Guterres has pointed out several times, no one country can beat this pandemic. International solidarity is therefore key, and this exchange today is an embodiment of that solidarity. I would now focus on the three questions I've been asked to respond to. The first one, of course, with regard to peace-building priorities in West Africa and Sahel that require attention in view of COVID-19 pandemic and the potential socioeconomic implications. The current crisis is exerting considerable pressure on the health systems and capacities in countries in the region, but at the same time exposing underlying gaps in governance systems. It will test, and it is testing, the capacity and willingness of national institutions to respond to the needs of populations, failure of which states may lose control over the situation. Therefore, ensuring that we support the governance infrastructures within the states to adequately respond to this challenge in the short, medium, and long term is immensely important. The pandemic is expected to severely disrupt high-stakes electoral processes planned for the latter part of this year in the sub-region, notably presidential elections in Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Guinea, and Niger. The voter registration processes and other key phases that have been suspended in some of these countries because of the pandemic could impact the calendar of elections. This raises important legal and politically complex questions if one should envisage postponement, especially in countries where the incumbents are finishing their last term. There is therefore the need for concerted efforts to ensure that there is consensus and genuine inclusiveness in addressing the implications of COVID-19 on electoral processes. This pandemic and the measures enacted to address it cut right deep into communities, and as a result, undercutting the social support systems and the resilience of communities. At present, local dispute resolution mechanisms may be affected as a result of the restrictions that have been imposed, which raises the possibility of latent grievances to be exploited. A community approach is necessary for beating COVID-19, as well as empowering communities to be prepared for mediation and long-term impacts. I cannot overemphasize the humanitarian crisis caused by increasing insecurity, especially in the Sahel, where violent extremists have been relentless in their attacks, totally ignoring the call of Secretary General for cessation of hostilities. Attention must remain on these issues as we address the pandemic, because as shown from the recent attacks by Boko Haram and ISWAP in the Lake Chad Basin and the Sahel, the violent extremists will definitely exploit any gaps. On the socioeconomic front, it is estimated that the economies of West Africa will contract by 5%. Fiscal deficits are expected to rise, while revenues will decline and inflation will rise. UNECA projects that the GDP, for instance, of Nigeria, the largest economy in Africa and the sub-region, is projected to fall from 2.9% estimated for this year to 1.3%, due to the fact that Nigeria represents 74% of the GDP of the ECOWAS space. The other countries in the region are expected to follow a similar trend. There is the possibility that we could see even sharper declines in the weakest economies. Combination of these factors will lead to increased unemployment and push more people into extreme poverty, thereby increasing social discontent with implications for peace and stability. On the second question regarding international support required to assist countries in West Africa and Sahel, let me say that it is important to amplify calls by the Secretary General to provide the financial relief packages to complement what states in the region are already doing, and it is appreciable. The recent steps taken by the G20 in suspending payments on debt servicing is a positive step and needs to also be expanded to include the non-LDC countries in the region. Support must be aimed at ensuring that the governance systems, both at central and decentralized levels, are operational in order to address this pandemic. There may be a need for financial and material support to some of the countries organizing elections, as resources may have been diverted to address the pandemic. In addition, political support will be required to advocate for the finalization of political dialogue processes and the implementation of their outcomes. Bilateral and multilateral political and material support for humanitarian assistance, as well as effort to prevent and counter violent extremism, must continue. Funding to support the meaningful participation of communities, including women, youth, and persons with disabilities, traditional, religious, and civic leaders in decision-making processes in this regard will be steps in the right direction. There may also be a need for support to enhance coherence in border management, which will be crucial once borders start reopening and the possibility of retransmission persists. On the last question of how conflict-sensitive responses to the pandemic led by government and affected communities in partnership with international financial institutions, regional and sub-regional organizations can be undertaken, including, of course, the role of civil society, I would like to state that, as earlier mentioned, it is critical that we support a whole of government approach in dealing with this pandemic. This calls for more coherence and targeted support to the governments in addressing some of the specific peace-building aspects of the overall response in the medium and long term. While many developed states are developing and coming up with new ways of working to continue key public services, it is imperative that we harness this knowledge to support states of the Sahel and West Africa for key public services beyond health that will be necessary to continue. Business continuity of governments is a key area that we should be supporting, targeting key areas beyond health, but also those that will reinforce peace and stability. Supporting civil society involvement in the response is equally important, noting that the imposition of state of emergency and other restrictions may reduce the civic space for debates on accountability issues, such as the appropriate use of resources destined to fight the pandemic. While the measures enacted to address the pandemic are necessary, their application should be respectful of human rights and the rule of law. We should consider supporting national human rights institutions to engage with other relevant national entities, such as the security forces, to prevent and address violations of human rights. And some of this, unfortunately, are being already reported by the different national human rights institutions. So we all need to work together, hand in glove, national, international partners, but also private sector, civil society. We need to stand together and have, as I said, an all of government approach as we face and deal with this pandemic. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Chambas. Thank you very much. Thank you for your words, and we really appreciate your briefing. So, and we'll come back to you with some questions and from member states after, if you have time to stay with us for a little while. Now, I'll give the floor to Oscar. Oscar.
Thank you, merci. Mr. Chair and members of the Peacebuilding Commission and everybody online, SRSG Chambas, it's very good to see you also, and thank you for being part of this meeting. Today, I quickly wanted to go over two aspects. One is the role of the Peacebuilding Commission in the context of COVID-19 as it relates to West Africa, the Sahel, and a quick update on the role of the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund in this context. So, thank you, Mr. Chair. And let me just start by saying that the PBC meeting of 8th of April called for the global solidarity that underscored the importance of the multilateral cooperation in the fight against COVID-19 pandemic in all countries under its consideration. This pandemic is demanding of member states, international regional organizations, international financial institutions, civil society, businesses, and people around the world, timely, multidimensional, and cross-pillar responses in line with the integrated logic of the SDGs. The Secretary General's commitment to peace building and sustaining peace is therefore today more of an imperative than ever to forge a common vision, show solidarity, and use common systems and capacities across the United Nations to consistently and adequately to show solidarity and to consider and adequately support the member states in their endeavor to sustain peace and build resilient, safe, and prosperous nations. Again, in line with their commitments to leave no one behind. In terms of what's happening in the Sahel and West Africa, and on the basis of very initial and informal data, we have seen how COVID-19 began to spread in the 5 G5 Sahel countries, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger in early March, reaching to 1,517 cases and 71 deaths cumulatively by 21st of April. Niger and Burkina Faso have seen a rapid spread of the virus, and together with Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, are the most affected countries in West Africa. On 14th of April, the Africa CDC, the Center for Disease Control, noted that the case fatality rate in Mali of 9% is significantly above the global average, which could imply that the number of cases is actually much, much higher. While the majority of cases have been reported in the capitals of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, some have also emerged in northern Burkina Faso, in the Tillabéri and Terroir regions of Niger, and in central Mali, which are among the most insecure areas of the Sahel. I say this because it is important to note how quickly the Peacebuilding Commission has been able to move in order to respond to the impact of COVID-19, and is providing this unique platform for international solidarity, including through predictable financing and strong partnerships for peace building in West Africa and the Sahel. The Commission has played a key role in support of peace building in West Africa and the Sahel through its various country-specific configurations, thematic and regional engagement. This includes the PBC support to Liberia, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, Guinea, the Gambia, and Burkina Faso, as well as the PBC regional engagements that have happened on the Manna River Union, West Africa, and the Sahel. Today's discussion is also evidence of the Commission will continue to accompany the efforts of the countries of West Africa and the Sahel region. Now, in terms of the Peace Building Fund, let me just reiterate that West Africa and the Sahel are priority regions for the Secretary General's peace building investment. We have already allocated over $137 million for the Sahel and Lake Chad region, which represents 25% of the resources allocated over the past 2 years. Within this portfolio of projects, we have invested significant resources, over 30 million, on cross-border projects in recognition that root causes of crisis and instability are often cross-border in nature. The fund has funded cross-border projects and are implemented throughout the Sahel in areas where state authority and the presence is very limited or at times inexistent. Data shows that border areas are often left behind in fragile states with limited or no state presence, lower access of border populations to basic services and justice, often leading to higher poverty and unemployment rates, higher gender inequalities, and a sentiment of abandonment of the border population. So complex security and operational challenges further characterize these areas. They are difficult to reach and access. The security situation can be very volatile. Movements can be quite limited, and very few NGOs or even at times UN agencies have established presence close to these border areas. The portfolio of cross-border peace-building programs in the Sahel and West Africa addresses the following key threats to peace and security: violent extremism, conflicts related to transhumance and the management of natural resources, lack of community security, weak justice and penal chain, and absence or weakness of inclusive and participatory conflict resolution mechanisms. The portfolio will continue to grow as part of the new strategy of the fund for the years 2020 to 24, as it recognizes the PBF's niche with regards to cross-border and regional programming. The fund is exploring how this year we will be working with local peace-building organizations, and this in response to an important point that SRSG Chambas brought up and has been brought up in other meetings of the Peacebuilding Commission, which is the importance of inclusivity and bringing in local communities as part of the overall response to COVID-19. So working with local peace-building organizations as part of the cross-border portfolio to complement ongoing efforts with a bottom-up peace-building approach, with the first pilot being rolled out in the Liptako-Gudma region. As a result of this initial review of emerging demands, and in order to complement what other funds, such as the SURF, the SDG Fund, and the newly established multi-partner trust fund for COVID-19, the PBF is reaching out and working closely with Robert Piper, DCO, and the other mechanisms to see where we can be supporting the UN country teams' responses to peace-building needs and priorities. And this has translated into basically 4 activities that we're hearing in terms of demand for the use of the fund. The first is to help reinforce crisis management capacities and communications of governments. And in a way, this has a lot to do with what SRSG Chambers was referring to as the importance of business continuity of governments, and important in terms of the type of messages and information. And here working very, very closely with WHO units in terms of what type of communication we're helping not just central, but local governments communicate in the community. The second area is to ensure inclusive and equitable responses and recovery. The third is to strengthen inter-community social cohesion and border management. And the fourth is countering hate speech and stigmatization and addressing issues of trauma. Again, we keep reaching out to resident coordinators' office to get a better understanding of the impact of the pandemic on peacebuilding priorities. We are welcoming new programming, which integrates this new layer of risk into peacebuilding proposals. And we're also adjusting existing programs as we learned to do during the past Ebola response crisis back in 2014. And to end, the Peacebuilding Fund strategy for the next 4 years will ensure that the SG's fund, as an integral part of the UN's peacebuilding architecture, remains at the core, as a core instrument at the heart of the UN's sustaining peace efforts, and a continued driver of coherence and meaningful impact where it is needed most. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oscar. That was very helpful. And so now I'll give the floor to, as additional comments from the region, to our friend Ambassador Adam Leone from Côte d'Ivoire. Leone, la parole est à vous, cher ami.
Monsieur le Président, let me join my predecessors to congratulate your country, Canada, and the Peacebuilding Commission for convening this timely meeting on the impact of COVID-19 in West Africa and the Sahel. Since December 2019, the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic has further increased socio-political and security vulnerabilities, both at local and regional level, and poses a serious risk to humanitarian efforts deployed by the international community. From my humble point of view, few trends have emerged in connection with the outbreak of the coronavirus, which deserve our closest attention. Number one, the risk of socio-political instability generated by the economic and social shocks deriving from COVID-19 and the responses proposed by the local authorities. Number two, the risks related to a potential weakening, even though temporary, of international humanitarian assistance in favor of an urgent response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Number three, the worsening vulnerabilities of the population living in conflicts-affected areas and internally displaced persons due to attacks by armed groups and intercommunity violence, of which women and children constitute the overwhelming majority. And finally, the impact of national, regional, and international conflict prevention mechanisms, including peacekeeping and peace-building initiatives. Mr. President, it's undeniable that structural vulnerabilities like poverty and unemployment, the lack or inadequate basic social services, and inter-community violence have fueled insecurity and instability across West Africa and the Sahel. Therefore, despite the gravity of the current health crisis, which mobilizes the attention of multi-layered efforts of the international community, fighting these structural vulnerabilities must remain at the heart of our priorities. We need to keep the current momentum in our fight against poverty and unemployment and our endeavor to improve our basic social services. The United Nations, including the Peacebuilding Commission, must therefore continue their efforts to mobilize development partners in order to preserve the overall positive peace and stability trends in West Africa and maintain the required level of support to countries in transition. COVID-19 has also triggered In addition, West African states to reconsider the hierarchy of their priorities in order to deal with the economic and social shocks of the pandemic. And I commend our leadership for the swift reactions of governments across the region. The objectives of the emergency response plans is to mobilize funding in support of local industries, in particular small and medium-sized enterprises, both sources of income and job providers for millions of citizens, as well as the informal sector, particularly affected by lockdown measures. For example, having already devoted more than 700 billion CFA to its social program, Côte d'Ivoire intends to devote 1,007 billion CFA to the financing of an economic, social, and humanitarian support plan, and 100 billion to support the informal sector. Mr. President, our advocacy is therefore addressed to the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and all development partners who are mobilizing funds to strengthen health system and deal with the economic impact of COVID-19. We need to seriously consider options relating to the provision of substantial financial assistance to West African and Sahel countries, including providing debt relief plans. We welcome the emergency measures and the moratoriums on debt decided by the G20 and the international financial institutions in order to allow the most vulnerable countries to effectively fight against this pandemic. But we need more vigorous and decisive debt relief initiatives to enable states in the region to further invest in healthcare, cross-border epidemiological surveillance, and the fight against food and nutritional security. We follow in the footsteps of President Macky Sall of Senegal, that a debt cancellation will provide better opportunities for economic revival conducive to the materialization of the SDGs. Last but not least, regional conflict prevention and peace-building mechanisms of ECOWAS must continue to benefit from multifaceted support of the United Nations. Needless to underline the crucial role of UNOWAS, whose cooperation with ECOWAS cannot be stressed enough, especially in mediation and good offices, and the implementation of the United Nations Integrated Strategy for the Sahel, UNIS. I would like to close my remarks by paying a well-deserved tribute to the World Health Organization and to all medical personnel involved in our common fight against COVID-19. I do believe that the mobilization and coordination of our efforts at the national, sub-regional, and international levels must remain our guiding light in order to eradicate the COVID-19 pandemic. I thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci Léon. Merci énormément pour ces propos et les énoncés des risques. Thank you very much. That was very clear and well done. So I will now go to Sheikh Mian au Senegal. Sheikh, are you available to talk now?
Yes, I am.
And then I'll go to Abari au Niger after that. Thank you.
From that, Jean-Marc-André, I would like to congratulate you and the PBC for organizing this timely meeting on a very important topic.
Yes.
And I would like to send my greetings to my twin, Leone from Côte d'Ivoire, who has preceded me, and I say also my special greetings to Dr. Chambers and to Mr. Fernandez Taranco and all the colleagues who are there. I'm going to give one global response to all the three very pertinent questions posed. And in doing so, I would like first of all to mention that the region which is under scrutiny today is home to states which have already been under the yoke of many adverse occurrences, namely severe economic situation, huge social disruptions, giving rise to an influx of refugees and IDPs, a dire environmental context in many difficulties in many areas, and an elusive terrorist and insurgent forces. And this context is being made worse by decreased capabilities of central governments, unable to live up to their responsibilities. Therefore, establishing an order of priorities is like undoing a Gordian knot, as the truth is that this is a region strife with huge vulnerabilities. Hence, our objectives have to be well identified. And those objectives must lead to immediate outcomes made possible by an urgent unraveling of targeted measures to fight this deadly pandemic. In our view, those measures should be articulated through an approach characterized by 3 major steps. The first step, in face of the mounting threats of COVID-19, is to seek to safeguard state capabilities, not only in fighting the pandemic, but also to help at the same time those states deliver their traditional missions in an effective manner by, among other measures, boosting their defense and security capabilities, or at least by maintaining them at the pre-COVID level. The second step, which is important to my delegation, is to make sure that we have a better coordination in assisting states in the region. Because of the gravity of this, and as is the case almost in everywhere in the world, because since we have seen this pandemic, we see that all countries are doing their own strategies, having their own initiatives. So there is a lack of coordination, and the lack of coordination in our region would be worse, would lead to devastating effects if we maintain that trend. So we are seeing so many different initiatives and strategies by states and organizations. Indeed, it would be of great value if there was some kind of regional strategy to the pandemic. In this regard, there should be a twofold perspective. We should have, on the one hand, an active cooperation between states, and on the other hand, also we should have a more effective coordination among international and regional mechanisms, organizations intervening in the region. The third step is to ensure proper channeling of funds. As far as the PBC is concerned, one overwhelming objective is to address one priority, which has already been identified, recognized among the 4 priority areas of the PBC in the region. And that priority area is called the re-establishment of basic services. Needless to point out that health services, which are per se essential services, particularly in these days of COVID-19, so health services in the region should be prioritized as the destination or as the main destination of funds from the PBC and from other donors. As we all know, a flailing health service will be of no use if ever the pandemic we are witnessing now in the region is to reach higher proportions. So in a nutshell, this is what I want to say, Marc-André. Once again, thank you very much and congratulations for the initiative of having this meeting. Thank you.
Merci, Sheikh. Merci beaucoup pour the 3 steps that are very clear. So now I'll go to Abari au Niger. Abari, tu as la parole. Abari, you're on mute.
Open it. Vous m'entendez maintenant?
Oui, on t'entend. Très bien. Merci beaucoup, Abari.
Voilà. Bonjour, Marc-André. And thank you for hosting this important meeting at a crucial time of the COVID-19 pandemic evolution on West Africa and the Sahel. And also thanks the Special Representative, Mr. Chambers, for his comprehensive expose. Thanks, colleagues, to see you looking great and in good shape. Leon, especially wearing your very, very nice bubu. Mr. Chair, even in the best of times, countries in the Sahel region face vulnerabilities owing to a worsening security situation which renders livelihoods challenging. The COVID-19 pandemic further exacerbates the vulnerability of fragile states and areas with armed conflict, which are of particular concern because they often have poor access to public health care, lack access to reliable water sources, and for refugees and displaced persons, even the security of a place to call home. In the Sahel region, the already precarious humanitarian situation risk is worsening. The latest estimates from the UNHCR show that the Central Sahel region shelters over 1 million refugees and IDPs, the majority of whom are women and children. A COVID-19 outbreak in a refugee setting would be disastrous. The establishment of humanitarian corridors must be a priority to ensure that what is already a dreadful situation does not descend the world's most vulnerable into a situation with unspeakable consequences. My delegation therefore fully supports the African Head of State's call for the operationalization of the African Union COVID-19 Response Fund. Mr. Chair, last week, the foreign ministers of the G5 Sahel, comprising Mauritania, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, and Mali, held an emergency meeting where they launched an appeal to the international financial partners for a cancellation of the African debt to respond to the serious consequences of the economic recessions threatening the continent and the Sahel states in particular, calling the COVID-19 pandemic the #1 enemy. Mr. Chair, the Sahel region, already fragilized by years of insecurity and humanitarian crisis, is now responding to the double threat of terrorism and COVID-19. Amidst the COVID-19 pandemic expansion into our countries, we must remain vigilant, as all signs show that terrorist groups may take advantage of the pandemic to gain ground at the time when the attention of many governments is focused on the fight against the disease. To that effect, we commend the decision of the joint AU-ECOWAS G5 meeting held in Niamey, Niger on 16 March 2020 to deploy an African force of 3,000 troops to support the countries of the Sahel in their fights against terrorism. We would also like to call for the Peacebuilding Commission to serve as a bridge between the different agencies working in containing the spread of the disease and mitigating its consequences. The PBC should also play a very crucial role in supporting host countries in mobilizing all available resources for their response to the pandemic on a coordinated and coherent manner. Mr. Chair, to conclude, our efforts must be firmly informed with a gendered approach. Many countries have reported an alarming increase in the number of incidences of gender-based violence and violence toward children. There is need to reinforce the child protection mandate in our peace-building priorities and ensure that measures account for the gender dimension of the crisis and how it amplifies existing inequalities. I fully share the concern raised by SRSG Chambas on the impact COVID-19 may have on electoral process in West Africa. In an environment of violence, like in the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin regions, it will be even more difficult to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. This is why we appreciate the call for a global ceasefire issued last month by Antonio Guterres and by the AU chairperson, Moussa Faki Mahamat. Only together we can fight terrorism and COVID-19. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Merci, Ambassador Abou. Merci. Thank you very much, Barry. So now I will go to Gambia, Ambassador Yabu. So Lang, you have the floor, and then after Gambia, I'll go to Burkina Faso. Eric, you'll be next. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair. Good morning, colleagues. I join others to thank Canada, PBC, and UNIVAS for organizing today's briefing. I seize this opportunity to thank His Excellency Marc-André and His Excellency Dr. Chambers for your commitment to peace and security in West Africa and the Sahel. I also thank Oscar and his entire team. The Gambia appreciate the usual support of UNIVAS under Dr. Chambers and the partnership between the government and the UN country team in Banjul. Mr. Chairman, undoubtedly, there is a clear linkage between food security, hunger, poverty, and peace and security anywhere in the world. Therefore, in West Africa and the Sahel, one of the best ways to sustain peace during this period is by helping the farming communities to produce enough food during the coming planting season. The international community should ensure that farmers are assisted to enable them produce to ensure food security, at the same time sell their produce for additional income. Enhancing local production should be encouraged in any food aid program for the region, and the international community should help in improving the ability and capacity of governments in the sub-region. With the complete slowdown of the region's economy, the potential impact of COVID-19 crisis, according to many experts, is expected to exceed that of the financial crisis of 2008. The crisis is already hitting the region's tourism, trade, remittances, transport, ability to create jobs, and without the needed help to governments in the form of debt cancellations to enable them provide stimulus packages such as supports to households in the form of cash transfers, packages for the affected businesses, etc., the crisis, in addition to the huge health collateral damages, would result in increased unemployment, poverty, and hunger in the region, all of which are not good for sustaining peace and security. Mr. Chairman, as we move forward with our response and recovery interventions, the international community should pay special attention to the needs of countries in conflict and transition, and every effort should be made to ensure coherence and consistency, as well as avoidance of duplication and partners working in silos. We all need to put our acts together and move in the same direction, with more support to governments and civil society organizations. The Gambia appreciate and thank the IMF, World Bank, G7, G20, the UN, and all bilateral and multilateral partners for the various initiatives launched to fight COVID-19. The Gambia, in addition, urged the United Nations, especially the PBC, to continue advocating for total debt cancellation and provision of more grants and stimulus packages for the poor countries, especially those in West Africa and the Sahel. Mr. Chairman, the outbreak of COVID-19 has reminded us that it is only through global partnership and working together that we can move our collective global agenda for peace, security, and development. The outbreak has taught us the need to strengthen the healthcare systems of countries around the world, especially those in the developing South. It is now clear to us that the collapse of a nation's health system would lead to the collapse of its economy and even its peace and security. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I would like to point out that when we had our crisis in 2016, 2017, PBC was among the first partners to respond to our call and has since been usefully engaged with us. I therefore once again, on behalf of the government and people of the Gambia, thank PBC, PBSO, and to once again ask for your continued support and partnership to help the Gambia and all the countries in West Africa and the Sahel to overcome the challenges of COVID-19 and beyond. We are confident that under your able chairmanship, PBC will achieve greater things for the Gambia and all the countries in the West African region and the Sahel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lang. Thank you. I appreciate your comments, and it's very good overview of the situation. particularly from an economic perspective. Thank you. So now I'll go to Burkina Faso. Ambassadeur Thiaré, Eric, vous avez la parole.
Monsieur le Président, bonjour. Do you hear me?
Oui, on t'entend. Merci.
Merci. First of all, I would like to join the others colleague to congratulate you, Chair of the PBC, for organizing this meeting. And it's an occasion for me to congratulate the SRG Chambers for being with us today. And also to thank Oscar and his team for the great job. Mr. President, my brother Abari has already speaks for me, but I will add some words. The implication of the COVID-19 on peace building and peacekeeping in West Africa are obvious, both for countries that are not in difficult situation and for those already experiencing a difficult security and humanitarian crisis. So, for countries already weakened by the difficulties, such as those in the G5 Sahel and Lake Chad, it is even more difficult to bear. Indeed, the situation in the countries of these groups is still marked by terrorist attack, and international support must be strengthened. Indeed, like other countries engaged in the fight against terrorism and violent extremism, a lot of countries devote budget for this fight, which continue to cause hundreds of deaths and thousands of international displaced persons. It is precisely because of that situation that Burkina Faso made a final presentation to the Peacebuilding Commission on the 5th of March, following the Joint Prevention and Peacebuilding Assessment Mission. Today, Burkina Faso is heavily affected by COVID-19, and terrorist attack continued, and the fight must be stepped and upgraded. Greater vigilance is required, as the health crisis could serve as a breeding ground for terrorism. The COVID-19 pandemic, this health crisis, is a major concern for all the countries of the world, the United Nations and the anti-United system, and its consequences are multidimensional. All countries have taken drastic measures to deal with. These include drastic restriction of the movement of population. However, a great many people in our countries live from day to day, earning their livelihood through their ability to move from one area to another, through trade and so and so. We commanded the general mobilization against the pandemic because if nothing is done, Africa will experience thousands of deaths due to insufficient health service. At the same time, however, we must remain vigilant because there is a risk of forgetting the challenge as already exists, namely the security and humanitarian crisis, for which we continue to seek the support of international community. It must be said that there is also a risk that, in addition to the health, security, and humanitarian crisis, there will be a food crisis that could affect more than 50 million people if vigorous measures are not taken to control prices, ensure the supply of food from family farms, and the transport of goods to market, to establish social safety nets to help the most vulnerable people. In view of the new situation created by the COVID-19 pandemic, which had led states to take difficult measures, it is absolutely essential for our countries to benefit from support of the TFP, technical partner, financial partner, international finance institution, and the international community. While welcoming the partial remission of the IMF debt, we must go further. It is in this sense that the foreign minister of G5 Sahel, as my brother Abari said, in Nouakchott, called on technical and financial partners to cancel African debt, pure and simple. In the area of the governance, the SRG chambers already speak about it. The West African sub-region will see many elections before the end of the year. This is the case of Burkina Faso. Those couple elections are in principle scheduled on 22 of November 2020. A meeting between the majority and the political opposition scheduled for yesterday, 21 of April, to discuss multi-sectoral measures taken in the fight against the coronavirus has been postponed to a later date. It should be noted that on the 17th of April, a first meeting between the parties took place on the several issues, including the electoral calendar. Will the election be held on time? It is to be feared that electoral issues could be a source of tension in the region. It is therefore necessary that the situation regarding the development of COVID-19 in the countries allow the special representative of the UN Secretary General, Ibn Chambers, to take up his mediation stick in order to avoid certain situations during the upcoming election. It's why UNOWAS must be support and strengthened. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, I will say that in the current global context in general, in the context of West Africa in particular, more than ever, there is a need for greater coordination in cooperation and exchange in security, health, economic, social, and humanitarian matters. We must return to one of our African values, which is African solidarity. Let's those who can help with various equipment and support, because we are less affected than others by the pandemic, do so at the sub-region level before we ask for help from other partners. I thank you.
Thank you, merci Eric. Thank you very much. It was very thorough. So I will go now to Ambassador Sanson from Nigeria. Please, Ambassador Sanson.
Mr. Chair, I want to, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Let me thank you and other briefers for this initiative, and to thank everybody that is here present. It is a thing of joy to see that everyone is doing great in isolation. Mr. Chair, COVID-19 pandemic unquestionably presents an era-defining challenge to public health and the global economy. The impact of the virus is most felt particularly in countries and regions where the international community has made considerable gains in fostering peace and development. It is in this regard that Nigeria urges that the West African and the Sahel region, facing multiple threats, including terrorism, intercommunal conflicts, food insecurity, and climate change, should continue to be a top priority for the United Nations peacebuilding efforts. With the spike in the number of cases with the virus, the crisis is already affecting fragile healthcare systems, employment, livelihoods, and incomes, and with potential of exacerbating underlying tensions in the region. There's also the danger of the crisis limiting gains already made in peace operations, diplomacy, and disrupting humanitarian aid flow. Women and children are hard hit already. Due to lack of internet facilities, many children are out of school and cannot study online. Internal dislocations due to violent extremism have not helped matters, while oil-producing countries like Nigeria are experiencing the worst crash of oil prices in 18 years. The political implications are also clear, as the crisis could disrupt major elections scheduled for 2020, and political conditions that could give rise to new crises while aggravating old ones in the region. In this context, it is difficult to decide on which priorities are most important in the region when they all appear urgent. But capacity is more limited, especially with the advent of COVID-19. To this end, we must continue to confront the pandemic and its consequences simultaneously, together, to prevent the reversal of peace and security gains in the region. With COVID-19, there is need for a coherent, common peace building strategy among international, regional, national financial institutions and private sector actors that focuses on significantly identifying the current triggers of conflict in country-specific settings to reduce the risk of countries relapsing into conflict. In certain parts of the region, we see that hunger resulting from lockdowns is exacerbating communal conflict. As they say, a hungry man is an angry man. We therefore urge the international community to continue to provide funding for immediate food assistance, as well as long-term recovery and development programs for people in the region. Nigeria also believes that debt initiatives are critical in assisting countries in West Africa and the Sahel to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on peace-building gains. In addition, the region needs more medical equipment, protective gears, testing kits, ventilators, face masks, etc. Furthermore, Nigeria acknowledges that the youth represent the biggest danger to peace consolidation in the region, but also the biggest opportunity with their energy, natural optimism, and innovative mindset. Consequently, Nigeria has continued to engage its youth population to produce powerful content with potent messages that discourage hate speech, xenophobia, and violence. Nigeria fully supports the Secretary General's global call for solidarity to help countries suppress the transmission of the virus while mitigating the devastating socio-economic impact of the virus. Countries in West Africa and Sahel require swift action to control further spread of the virus and improve their response system. Nigeria, on its part, has invested over $1.4 billion to support her healthcare sector. We have also approved the creation of a coronavirus fund to strengthen the country's healthcare infrastructure. We're happy to note that the private sector is contributing to the fund. We have sustained the social investment program of government and expanded the dragnet of the beneficiaries of the cash transfers extended to the poor, including people with disabilities. We're also ensuring that our national priorities for recovery, political, social, and economic, redress any inequalities and positively influence gender relations and contribute to gender equality. Nigeria remains committed to working with the economic community of West African states, as well as the African Union, to conquer the unprecedented impact of COVID-19 in the region and continent at large. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ambassador Samson. That is, for your, your comment on youth is particularly inspiring. So now I'll go to Fatima, Ambassador Mohamed from the African Union, and then I'll go after that. I'll go outside the region, but just slightly to just so I'm getting you in advance. Morocco, Colombia, Egypt, Kenya will be the next speakers after that.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and good morning, colleagues. Let me start by, first of all, thanking you for convening this timely virtual meeting on West Africa and the Sahel, and particularly on one of the greatest challenges of our time. And also thank Dr. Chambas and Oscar and all the ambassadors who spoke before me for their contributions. Chair, as you're aware, the Bureau of the African Union Assembly of Heads of State and Government, chaired by President Ramaphosa of South Africa, has underscored the importance of having a continental response in order to arrest the rapid spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this has stretched public health systems and placed enormous stress on the social and economic systems of our AU member states. The Bureau in particular noted that the Sahel region needed special attention. Although the official numbers of the infections remain relatively low compared to other parts of the continent, of course you're aware that the region itself is confronted with a number of other challenges which could have additional devastating effects. That said, Mr. Chair, I'd like to very quickly focus my comments on 3 points, which are key priorities that have been identified by the Bureau of the Union in terms of political, social, and economic challenges, as well as efforts that are required. My first point, Chair, is on the triple challenges. This has been elaborated by the speakers before me, but I'd like to just re-emphasize that the triple challenges of insecurity, climate change, and now the pandemic gives us the need to give special attention to this region, especially because it's already fragile, conflict prone, and of course is affected by climate issues. The region is also confronted in particular by adverse effects of drought and food insecurity, with the resultant forced displacement, refugees, and humanitarian crisis. There are also concerns that the locust invasion from East Africa could spread to the Sahel, thereby further exacerbating the existing challenges, including those induced by the pandemic. And responding to these challenges require coordination and coherence of international efforts. My second point, Mr. Chair, is on creating a fiscal space. The AU has called on the World Bank, the IMF, and international lenders to develop a comprehensive stimulus package for Africa, including giving consideration for deferred payments, the immediate suspension of interest payments on Africa's external public and private debt in order to create a fiscal space for COVID-19 response measures. The AU has acted swiftly to establish a coronavirus fund with commitments already totaling approximately $20 million. And I'm pleased to inform you that the chairperson of the Union has also appointed special envoys to mobilize international efforts for Africa's efforts to address the economic challenges in these countries as a result of the pandemic. And West Africa and the Sahel would benefit from the engagements of the envoys. My third point, Mr. Chair, is on opening humanitarian corridors. As you're aware, most of the African countries have closed their borders and are implementing lockdown measures to allow for testing and contact tracing. However, the unintended consequences of border closures, if prolonged, would be dire for humanitarian and socioeconomic activities, particularly for the landlocked countries. In view of this, African leaders called for the opening of humanitarian transportation corridors for medical and other supplies. Maintaining the supply chain for essential services should be a critical aspect of any response strategy. The significance of opening transport corridors, especially for landlocked countries in the Sahel, cannot be overemphasized. Mr. Chair, having highlighted the points above, permit me to also underscore that immediate efforts in West Africa and the Sahel need to focus also on, first, strengthening the primary healthcare systems of conflict-affected countries in West Africa and the Sahel, the strengthening of national and subnational health surveillance systems, responding to the food and nutritional needs of vulnerable communities, and finally, provisions of finance to support immediate recovery across the region. I'd like to conclude, Mr. Chair, by reaffirming the AU's commitment to support its member states in the region and commend the PBC and the broader UN system, as well as other international partners, for their efforts to provide the required support to cushion the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic in West Africa. I thank you, Mr. Chair, for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Thank you for this, very helpful. So now I'm Omar from Ambassador Ilal from the Maroc, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, cher ami and dear Chair, Ambassador Blanchard, for the initiative of convening this series of important meetings of the Peacebuilding Commission, PBC, in these times of crisis caused by COVID-19 pandemic. I would like also to thank SRSG and head of the United Nations Office for West Africa and Sahel, UNWAS, Mohamed Ibn Gambas, for his insightful presentation and his engagement in these challenging times. My thanks go also to my dear friend USG Oscar for his commitments and his leadership and his mobilization, permanent mobilization in this very difficult time. I wish to seize this opportunity, Mr. Chair, to express my delegation's compassion and solidarity with all those who are fighting the COVID pandemic and all the families affected by it. The world is facing an unprecedented worldwide scourge, which has proven to make no distinction between categories of countries and people. However, for regions such as Africa, the adverse and negative effects of the pandemic act as threat multipliers, especially with regards to day-to-day peace building and sustaining peace challenges, namely in West Africa and the Sahel. This unfortunately signals that the pandemic can have a considerable destabilizing potential on the democratic, political, economic, and social trend of the countries of the whole region. In some countries of the region, this impact also translated into worsening of the already severe food and nutrition crisis in the region, where several tens of millions of people are threatened. And I think we can see that, I just want to say here that World Food Program issued a report yesterday from Rome saying that the hunger and the starvation will affect more than 170 million all around the world. And half of them will be in Africa, and most of this half in Africa will be in the region of the Sahel. That is calling us to act quickly, to act united, and to mobilize all the goodwill and the energies and assistance to help these countries. The list goes on and on. Prospects might seem alarming in the light of spread of COVID-19 in the region, and it is safe to recognize today that the pandemic is likely to hamper, stall, or even reverse very hard-won peace building and sustaining peace gains in the region. This is why we need meetings such as today, and why we have to remain more than ever before committed to bring helping hand to the countries affected in the region in full respect of the national priorities and ownership. Preserving ongoing peace building and sustaining process in Africa and the Sahel is our shared responsibility. As we also recall that DSG Amina Mohammed highlighted at our last meeting that the magnitude of our response must match the seeds of the global and borderless crisis. We heard very instructive briefing from the field today, and especially from all my brothers and colleagues of the region. And my delegation wishes to salute the effort that are currently deployed by the governments, women and men of the region, as well as by the ECOWAS and UNOWAS, West Africa Health Organization, WAHO, Development Partners and Peace Building Commission, PBC, despite this very daunting times. Thanks to the unique hinge status within the United Nations system, the PBC was designated to play a constructive role in times such as this, primarily by, one, maintaining a continued attention on the challenges affecting the region, two, taking the mobilization of the key partners forward, and three, leveraging its advisory role, especially to the Security Council as well as in the country-specific configuration, and four, pulling on its extensive experience to come up with innovative ways to help prevent and mitigate the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Concerning Morocco, Mr. President, I would like to say that the Kingdom of Morocco under the leadership of King Mohammed VI is also reflected on the need for a continental preventive response to the COVID-19 pandemic in order to overcome the social and economic impact of the pandemic. This initiative has already been kick-started with several African leaders, namely with regard to knowledge and technology sharing. Morocco just also organized a airline shuttle between China and South Korea and Korea to bring to many African countries material, equipment, and supplies to fight corona virus. To conclude, Mr. President, I would say just that country-specific configuration of the PBC have also an important role to play in this regard, as they are the bridge between the field and our commission. Regarding the Central African Republic configuration that I have the honor to chair, we are currently coordinating together with the PBSO, DPO, and MINUSCA to organize a meeting early May. It will be an opportunity to be informed in detail on the impact of the pandemic, in particular regarding important aspects such as the elections and the implementation of the peace agreement. Mr. President, I give you back the floor, and I wish to thank you once again for convening this important meeting. Thank you, Marc-André.
Merci, merci Omar, merci pour tes propos. Thank you. And now I'll give the floor to Guillermo, the Vice Chair of the Peacebuilding Commission and my great predecessor. So, Guillermo.
Thank you, Marc-André. Let me express my gratitude and admiration for convening this meeting. You know how important for the Peacebuilding Commission has been the West Africa and the Sahel. And your leadership and your concerns regarding the situation in this part of the world has been really, for us, very, very important. I would like to welcome Mr. Chamba's remarks and the ideas he has shared with us for this discussion. The same for Oscar's comments and reflections, and all the comments that our colleagues, ambassadors, has made that give us a real, very important, clear situation of what is going on there. Colombia agreed with the Deputy Secretary General's comments during the meeting of April 8 in terms that we must address the pandemic from all different perspectives. As mentioned today, for Mr. Chambas, is a multidimensional crisis. As PBC, we have the opportunity to be a platform where policies and practices are discussed to face the pandemic and to confront the risk to peace building in fragile scenarios. The strategies for sustainable response for the crisis must address economic development opportunities in the countries engaged with the Commission to be able to prevent new cycles of conflict. In that sense, we need to maximize the impact of our collective efforts and support West Africa and the Sahel countries, as well as the effective cooperation with UNOWAS and the broader UN system, the African Union, the G5 Sahel, the European Union, and other international partners. In this point, I have a question regarding the role that the African Band is playing in this particular case. I would like to commend the countries in the Sahel for their continued efforts toward development and stability. The PB Fund can be used as a flexible tool to support stability and prevent crises, especially where other actors might not seem suitable. But we have to coordinate all efforts through different funds that are working to fight the pandemic. Oscar make a very clear points. I'm very glad to listen his remarks regarding the coordinations with these funds, because I believe it's very important to do that. The complex political, security, humanitarian, political and development challenges facing the Sahel region require persistent attention and coordinated support from the international community. You know, dear friends from the West Africa and the Sahel, that you can count with the PBC as our chairman is doing. I would like to conclude on the line that the PBC has to redouble its effort aimed at sustaining international engagement and further enhancing coherence and coordination between the national, regional, and international partners in the Sahel and West African region. Thank you very much, Mar-Andre, and thank you, our colleagues and Mr. Chambers, for being with us today.
Thank you, Guillermo. And I'll now give the floor to Mohamed from Egypt, Ambassador Address. Mohamed.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, dear friend Marc-Andre, and everyone. Actually, the role of PBC and its chairman, I think, is more important now than ever. I would like to welcome and appreciate the presence of His Excellency Mr. Bichambas. We're happy to have you with us here, though at distance, and we wish you all success in your efforts, and to welcome Oscar and appreciate his effort and his team and all colleagues who spoke before. In very brief, I think everyone highlighted that this crisis is multifaceted, so the impact is going to be multidimensional, and especially it's impacting all countries, big and small, but definitely the impact on countries where the infrastructure and the resilient infrastructure is lacking is going to be more impactful and more significant. I think two important issues need to be taken care of swiftly is the impact on terrorism, and to avoid that terrorism will make use of this vacuum which is happening. And the other thing is food security. It's important to avoid also the consequences of food security on sisterly countries in Sahel. And it's time to provide all support to our sisterly countries in the Sahel region. Of course, before we're struggling to have a new additional impact. Now I think the struggle is double-fold, is to preserve what we already achieved and to try to make something additional. But even preserving what we have already had is now threatened. As it is a world, it's a whole world fight, it's also a whole society approach which needs to be adopted. And I think the PBC now needs to have convening power and coordinating power. These are very important. And the PBC has an edge in this field. Last point is a question that we were always complaining about, having multi-strategies for the Sahel region. So at this time, is it a time to have a unified overarching strategy, or we are going to have a new additional strategy for the Sahel region? Thank you very much.
Actually, I would say very good question, Mohamed. Thank you on the question of the unified strategy. So I'm now going to Ambassador Amario from Kenya. Lazarus, you have the floor.
Chair and dear colleagues, may I begin by thanking you, Marc-Andre, our chair, for convening this important meeting. I also wish to thank Dr. Chambers and Mr. Fernandez for informative briefings they have given us. I cannot at the same vein forget to acknowledge and thank our colleagues from West Africa and the Sahel who have spoken from points of information on what is actually obtaining on the ground and what needs to be done. I also thank my sister Ambassador Fatima for highlighting the AU initiatives on COVID-19 agenda. Mr. Chairman, addressing the impact of pandemics, including COVID-19, can never be exclusively a national endeavor. As we have heard from the briefings, and I thank Chambers for what he had said, the issues are multifaceted, cross-cutting, and cross-border in nature. Consequently, a regional approach is of necessity, but I think even more imperative is the need for global solidarity and multilateral approach in the fight against COVID-19 and its consequences. From the shared reports, it is also encouraging to see that strategic budgeting that is heavy on regional cross-border issues, as well as partnerships between the Peacebuilding Fund with key stakeholders, including UNDP, UNICEF, IOM, and World Food Programme. Chair, this is also particularly evident in the Sahel region, and also true to the Horn of Africa, where most countries and the sub-regions are already dealing with the pandemic within multiple crisis environment, ranging from insecurity, climate change, and other socioeconomic challenges. The impact of the pandemic on various sectors of the vulnerable communities, as our brothers talked about, the refugees and IDPs, with particular reference to women, children, youth, and even people living with disabilities, not to mention farmers and pastoralists who are also dealing with challenges of desertification, drought, scarcity of water cannot be overstated. But one of the main important ways the international platform like this one and PBC can support national and regional initiatives during this time is to highlight the local mitigation measures being undertaken and the persistent gaps, particularly in situations where the pandemic is just but one of the challenges and that the population is experiencing. We therefore welcome information on the ongoing work, as I saw in the concept note, the work of West African Health Organization and ECOWAS towards this end. We cannot forget also to acknowledge with appreciation support from the UN itself and development partners and organizations, but much more is still needed to tackle the existing challenges and even debts like our brothers Leone, Lamb, and Eric had mentioned. In conclusion, perhaps I could pose a question here to the briefers, asking that whether there are any ongoing or future targeted projects regionally or within the PBF itself and the World Health Organization, given that pandemics are becoming part of the norm or becoming more regular in our region, going by the Ebola experience. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It's true indeed that they're becoming more of a, one every less than every 10 years these days. So thank you very much, Lazarus, for that. I would like to go to the Vice Chair of the Peacebuilding Commission, the other Vice Chair, the Permanent Representative of Japan. Himero, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Chambers. I think we are really facing situations where human security is at risk. So one thing that we learned from the Ebola outbreak in West Africa is the paramount importance of trust. Stopping the outbreak depends on changing people's behavior and mindset. And this can only happen if people have trust in authorities, whether or not it is a developed or a developing country. I believe one way of building this trust is by empowering local communities through a holistic and coordinated approach. Delivering at the local level can help strengthen human security and resilience while fostering development, and so build people's faith in government institutions. This approach helps us combat not just COVID-19, but also violent extremism. As I highlighted during last month's Security Council meeting, empowering local communities and strengthening institutional capacity are key to breaking the vicious cycle that breeds radicalization. We must not let terrorist groups exploit the pandemic for their own ends. To help achieve regional peace and stability, Japan emphasizes human resource development and capacity building in the judicial, administrative, and legislative institutions, as well as youth vocational training. Here, I also wish to highlight JICA's education program named School for All, which began in Niger in 2004 and has been adopted by more than 45,000 schools, mainly across West Africa. What makes this program distinctive is that it facilitates collaborative work between schools and the communities to improve children's learning environments. The School for All program has led to improved access to quality education and greater enrollment of girls. It might seem odd to emphasize an education program while discussing a pandemic, but what I want to underscore here is that a community-centered approach has great potential for sustaining peace and making society resilient against an unexpected shock like COVID-19. But I'm also very much proud to say that we are one of the major contributors to global humanitarian response plan to fight against the virus, and we will be doing more shortly. We believe both of these initiatives are essential and intertwined. And I also touch upon one thing which was raised by many colleagues. It's a coordination problem. And I'd like to reiterate my position that aid coordination cannot happen in a faraway office, but should take place in the field among those who know best the reality on the ground. So I think we should make clear who's doing what to those players on the ground by disclosing the assistance cause all of us has in hand. Finally, I believe this approach supports SRSG Chambers' work on the ground. We tend to focus on the health and economic consequences of the pandemic, which is very natural, but we must also consider broader impacts, including political repercussions, particularly with several important West African elections imminent as we consider how best to support the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Brazil, Ambassador Filo. Ronaldo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for convening this meeting on the impact of COVID-19 in West Africa and the Sahel. I wish most particularly to thank you for the enthusiasm with which you have thrown yourself into the function we all agreed was the main one that PBC should be undertaking now in the aftermath of COVID-19, which is to keep a focus of the international community on those vulnerable countries that are transitioning from situations of conflict to sustained peace and sustainable development. So thank you for that. Let me also thank SRSG Chambas and Oscar for the updates and the important information they have brought to us on what is going on and what is being done in support of these countries. I also appreciate in particular the statements made by our colleagues, the permanent representatives from countries in the region, which have very clearly given us indications of what their priorities are in this situation. And I think this is the starting point for any support of the international community, is to take into account and lead from the priorities of the countries themselves. Now, Mr. Chair, my briefing notes now say I should reiterate something that Kimihiro has just said, which is the importance that UN missions, agencies, and funds coordinate the support, create synergies, and avoid duplication of efforts. And I reiterate that with great emphasis. I think this is key. At the same time, let me say, I think we have to practice what we preach. And I think it's time that we also look inwards at the intergovernmental bodies here at the UN, and also strive to avoid duplication and coordinate the work among different bodies. Now, the main point I would like to make is that we have to give very particular attention to balancing the short-term and the long-term support to these countries. And I think something that our colleague from Côte d'Ivoire was very clear on highlighting. Because in many ways, there is a similarity between a security threat and a humanitarian crisis, in that the international community tends to focus on the most immediate needs of populations at risk. But much of this falls outside the domain of development cooperation. So we cannot neglect that whatever we do, whatever we pledge in humanitarian assistance, this must be harmonized with the long-term support aimed at ensuring structural development and peace-building goals, because this is the only way to get to the key word in all of this, which is sustainability, sustainability of peace and sustainability of development. So I think this is the main message I would like to leave with the Commission today. Let me just add that I did take note with great interest on the number of interventions that highlighted the number of electoral processes which are scheduled in the region this year. SRSG Chambas was very clear on this and on the risk that COVID-19 could play in these processes. I think this is one area where particular support has to be considered, because it's vital that we contribute to the process of consolidating democratic governance in West Africa. So I think this is a very important topic. Finally, as chair of the Guinea-Bissau configuration, let me take advantage of you having convened this meeting, Mr. Chair, to give a very brief update on the situation in that country. You know, the situation there remains very, very volatile, with a de facto government led by Umaru Sissoko Embalo, and legitimate government represented by Prime Minister Aristides Gomes. And we are also, I think, very concerned with the perceived interference of the military in the political arena. Now, after 4 months, almost 4 months of the second round of elections, the Supreme Court has still to decide on the appeal lodged by candidate Domingos Simões Pereira. The P5 group, which comprises the UN, CPLP, the African Union, ECOWAS, and the European Union, has not recognized Sissoko as legitimate president. Now, this political impasse poses a significant challenge in the context of COVID-19. Any dialogue with one of the parties may be misconstrued as international support or recognition. This is why the P5 group in Guinea-Bissau has requested that the UN resident coordinator and the representatives of the World Health Organization and the World Bank be the focal points of the international community in Guinea-Bissau on issues pertaining to COVID-19. The country has around 50 confirmed cases so far, but with no fatalities. But the situation in the country requires special attention in light of its fragility and the ability, or the lack of ability to deal with a health crisis that could deteriorate the situation even further. So as I say, this is just a call to keep, as you have been doing very ably, Mr. Chairman, to keep the focus of the Commission on not only on Guinea-Bissau, but on all the countries in this situation of particular vulnerability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ronaldo. Thanks for your kind words. I'm now going to, from the chair of the configuration for Guinea-Bissau to the chair of the configuration for Liberia. So Ambassador Instrom from Sweden. Anna Karen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marc-André, and my appreciation to Dr. Chambas, to Oscar for their briefings. Also very much to the colleagues in the region. I agree with Ronaldo just said about that we need to put their priorities and their needs into the center of our discussion. I also agree with what Dr. Chambas said about the importance of international cooperation and solidarity. I think we see really right now the most challenging crisis that we have experienced since UN was set up. So this is something we need to push for. I think also what Kimihiro said about the trust, the trust from the people to the government and authorities in dealing with this crisis is also very, very important, I think, for all of us. So let me make four points, Marc-André. First, it's evident in these discussions and even more today, that we need to deal with the COVID, the acute crisis and phase of the COVID-19 at the same time as we are continuing to support the ongoing peace building and democratic processes in West Africa and Sahel. We already heard from Dr. Chambers and others the risk of having the electoral processes pushed back, of having democratic principles and human rights set aside. We have also heard from Nisher and other colleagues about the importance of putting gender issues up front, of the risk for social unrest and tensions in these countries that are building on an already very fragile and vulnerable situation. And I think I would really echo those that have called for increased coordination, especially on the ground. We know that there are very many organizations, including UN organizations, working with the socioeconomic consequences, but we really should work in a coordinated way. And I think here the Peacebuilding Commission can play an important role, including with its country-specific configurations. Secondly, to echo what Oscar and others said about the importance of communication. Reliable and credible information needs to reach the population and be made accessible in different languages. An open and honest dialogue between governments, local communities and civil society is of course key. Strengthen coordination and information sharing between governments, the UN, regional organizations, donor and local actors is crucial. And we need actively, as donors and others, to counter disinformation and proactively finance producing and spreading accurate and adequate evidence building based information. Third, on the short, medium and long-term implications. We as others see a need for a nexus response, including responses related to access to water and sanitation, basic healthcare, food security has been underlined by many, as well as resilience strengthening and peace building efforts. I think Fatima had a very important point as well on the importance of open humanitarian and transport corridors. Important also to look at and analyze the long-term impact of lockdowns and related measures. This includes economic effects on closing markets and schools, as well as again ensuring that enforcement measures are proportional. In the medium to long term, it will be important to continue with decentralization and resilience building efforts. And lastly, on financing, and again, to underline the importance of good peace-building donorship, including ensuring more coherent approaches within and between donors and international financial institutions. Thanks again, Marc-André, for a very, very important meeting, and good afternoon soon to everyone.
Thank you very much, Anna-Karen. Thank you. I'll now go to Olaf at the European Union. After that, it's going to be Norway, Ireland, Korea, Peru. So just so that.
Marc-André,
thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marc-André. Good to see colleagues dressed up and in good spirits. I must say it's always reassuring to see our friend SRSG Chambers and listen to him. Somehow it's reassuring to see his presence and hear him, and knowing that he's active in this difficult situation. Marta, I see you there too, our colleague from Ghana. I just want to say that I read an impressive piece from your Minister of Finance the other day. I think in one of the international papers, he described a day as Minister of Finance in a country which is already, of course, struggling under difficult fiscal circumstances, and in addition comes the pandemic. So I thought it was heartening to see, and it just reconfirms what all of you have been saying. I have listened carefully. I think a few things I just wanted to echo. One is the point that Mr. Chambers made early on about the state of emergencies, the electoral processes that will be difficult to carry through, etc., and the risks that comes with that. I think Eric from Burkina Faso raised this as well. So I would also really hope that we can all support UNOWAS and the Secretary General's and the UN's efforts in trying to mitigate that kind of risk, including working with civil society, ensuring that human rights and the democratic space is kept open. So to the extent also, Oscar, that the PBF, as always, can be attentive to that, we would be very supportive. On the ceasefire, this is for Sahel. Problem here is, of course, that the party that we're looking to respect the Secretary General's call are terrorist organizations, and it's just so horrifying to see that instead of respecting that this is an opportunity to look for peace, they are actually, in many cases, accelerating their terrible actions. So, but again, also, if there is anything we all can do to better support the Secretary General's cause here, let us know. The Security Council has, of course, not been able to express itself, and I know that it's very important for mediators on the ground to have that backing. But in the absence of that, I hope we can all help in other ways. On the socioeconomic side, I just want to say that the EU has really stood up for this, trying to work for debt relief, appealing to others to give that suspension. The private sector here is, of course, the difficult ones to reach, but it also speaks to the fact that in these sessions we really need to have the IMF, the World Bank, and the regional banks present to understand how they can hear the message from you on the ground and play along. The EU's package of 20 billion euros, and we tried to inform colleagues about it the other day, it tries to focus on emergency response, strengthen health system, water, sanitation, etc., but also to work on the economic, social side. And I just want to encourage you, colleagues, and that your governments reach out to the EU delegations in your countries and ask them, how can you tap into that money? How can some of the projects that were in the pipeline be adjusted to the current situation in line with the plea that you're all making here? So it's very concrete. And final point, those of us who joined you, Mark, Andrea, to the region last year, Guillermo and Mohammed, I mean, we saw the virtue of regional cooperation in West Africa. And of course, that is, I just want to echo the point that many of you have made. The region is stepping up, but there is just so much to be done there in terms of border control, of keeping markets open, and solidarity across borders. So whatever we can do there to support that work as well, we are absolutely attentive to that. Thank you, everyone, and be safe and be well.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. And now I go to Pierre, Norway, Mona. Ambassador Jewel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marc-André, and thank you so much for organizing this meeting. Thank you also to the SRG and to Oscar, both of them as always giving us a very good introduction and describing where we are in this difficult situation. I also, like others, really appreciate the interventions from our colleagues from the region. I mean, you are the ones that know what's going on, and we need to hear it from you directly. At this stage, of course, many things has been said, but it is also important for me representing Norway that we would like to express our solidarity with everyone affected by the pandemic, and other challenges in West Africa and Sahel. As a common threat, it is clear that we must respond to COVID-19 with solidarity in the spirit of multilateralism. As underlined by others, we must do so in a coordinated manner, in close partnership with national authorities. While the health consequences of the pandemic may still be at an early phase in some countries in the region, already we see negative impact on the security situation. And unfortunately, the effect of the virus on the financial situation are very, very present. National authorities are rightly requesting international assistance, not least from regional organizations. We believe that the African Union, along with the UN and the International Financing Institution, will be central in the continent's response to the pandemic. So to this end, Norway will further increase our support to strengthen AU's capacity and resources. And it was good to hear from Amina that what the AUs are working full speed also on this. I am hopeful that we also could be able to provide support to the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, in order to build national capacity, coordinate and distribute medicines, and deploy experts. Norway will also continue to contribute substantially to various initiatives and organizations countering the pandemic. I will not list them here, but I will take the opportunity to underline to other donor countries the important role of core funding in the pandemic response. Core funding allows the UN organizations to be flexible, responsive, and to channel resources to where they are needed most. Furthermore, we encourage all who can contribute to the new UN COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund to combat the long-term effect of the crisis. Finally, on financing. I will just end by summing up my response to the guiding questions for this meeting. Question 1. On the peacebuilding priorities, they should include a vigorous and coordinated response both to the pandemic itself and its economic and social consequences. No efforts should be spared to build sustainable peace. On question 2, on international support to West Africa and Sahel, I would like to add here the need for solidarity, both in words and action. And finally, question 3, on support to the country's responses to the pandemic. This, of course, might look like a little simplistic response, but it's about funding. That is, of course, unquestionably crucial. And of course, along with political support. I think I stop there. And thank you once again for letting us take part in this very informative and good meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mona, for the very structured points that you've made, and thank you. Now we go to the permanent representative of Ireland, Ambassador Nason, our friend Geraldine. Geraldine, you have the floor.
Thanks very much indeed, Marc-André, and good to see everyone. And thanks for the excellent briefings, and particularly for the colleagues from the region this morning. I mean, if we needed any convincing that COVID-19 is a threat, I think we just need to look at the Sahel region to see what the extraordinary impact could be. If I leave this meeting with one thought, it will be with Sheikh's image of the Gordian knot this morning. Because I think the message we're hearing in spades is that what looks like a healthcare crisis in this region, of course, is so much more than a healthcare crisis, so much more complex. Leone, your point about the political economic shock at the beginning, we need to keep to the fore of our thoughts. But also I think that the risk we've heard underlined by several speakers of an interruption to humanitarian assistance is a huge threat that this crisis brings. So it's a sort of, in a way, I guess what we're hearing here in relation to the Sahel is that COVID risk being in a way weaponized in itself. If it's shown us its hidden power anywhere, even in our own societies, it tends to go for the weak spots with older people being affected. Clearly it will now have a huge impact in any regions where we have fragility, and we know that we have seen this. But what I want to say on this point of watching how COVID shines that light and has a bigger impact in fragile regions is that we absolutely need to respond to what we heard from colleagues this morning, saying that we cannot allow ourselves to be blown off course now, and to see that the hard-won efforts at development and particularly at stabilization, at peace and security in this region in particular, that we keep our focus there, that we don't get deflected, and that this steps in global solidarity remember that it's a development, peace and security issue that we're dealing with, not just a healthcare issue. The SRSG, always great to see you, Chambas, online. I and PBSO colleagues, of course. We had been looking forward to, as the SRSG will know, a special meeting in Dublin with the EU special envoys and ambassadors for the Sahel. Unfortunately, the crisis interrupted that. We hope to see you in a virtual Dublin conversation. We hugely appreciate what you're doing on the ground. I have 3 quick points to make before concluding, Marc-Andre. The first has been made by others, but it can't be repeated enough. The regional coordination. In a way, we're lucky in that the Sahel region, with the impressive efforts, and I want to thank Fatima this morning for her presentation of what the AU is doing, banked by what we know is a strong institutional capacity in ECOWAS. We've often seen that come into play. We need both of those acting more than ever. And Olaf, as he spoke, made it very clear what the European Union is doing with not just huge resources for COVID, but also with, I think, a refined sense, because of its presence on the ground across the region, that now is the time to look at restructuring. I would call out, though, to go back to Sheikh's point about the Gordian knot, that as we all look at restructuring, my own country is looking at restructuring its resources in the region, that we don't end up in some unintended way making that knot tighter rather than looser. There is a risk in our response of unintended consequence, and we are very sensitive to that. We've heard about it from our colleagues from the region today. So I just wanted to underline that, and to highlight in particular a point that Fatima made about the humanitarian corridors and capacity to respond to humanitarian need. The second point really is to say that now is not the time for us to be shy at the big macro level. You heard from Olaf that the EU, and certainly my country, is fully supporting the efforts in the World Bank, IMF, to work to improve, in fact, to support debt relief calls and to deliver on the ground. This is the time for our big steps now to actually come in and make a difference in terms of the results on the ground. I also wanted just to say that we appreciate very much in the African Development Bank the innovative social bonds and the COVID response there. We recognize that's not enough for the region, but we think they're very good mechanisms and they're going in the right direction. So finally, really just to return to the calls we heard earlier, and if it's one message, it is that we can't allow this moment to push us back. We see this in other agendas. We say it all the time about women and girls. And I think what our colleague from Japan said this morning about education is really important, that we don't allow this moment to interrupt efforts to keep good development practices on the ground and humanitarian support alive. And my own president tomorrow has written, I think, a heartfelt op-ed in our main newspaper about Africa and COVID. But he makes the point that this crisis, of course, will pass. But its severity and its magnitude are actually in our hands now, and that this crisis really should empower us to act, not to lose hope in the face of this challenge. And that's a code for not getting blown off course at the moment when international solidarity is needed most, and more than ever in a region like the Sahel. So thanks again, Marc-Andre, for a very good discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. Thanks, and your comments about not allow this moment to push us back is so true. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm now going to go to Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for convening today's meeting. And I also would like to join other colleagues in extending my appreciation to our informative briefers. We greatly appreciate the efforts of the PBC as a whole in elevating international awareness and attention to the COVID-19 issue in the West Africa and Sahel region. The ROK has always been supportive of the engagement with the PBC in this region and contribute to enlarging PBC's role as elaborated in our effort for ECOSOC resolution last year titled the Support to the Sahel region. Although ROK also suffered a lot due to COVID-19 pandemic at an early stage, we have managed to flatten the curve and successfully held general election as scheduled in mid-April. As such, we stand ready to share our relevant experience and lesson learned as appropriate with the regional countries. My government also donated a level 2 mobile hospital in the Sahel region, which is now operational by the Mali government since September 2019. We hope that the hospital can contribute to effective regional response to COVID-19, and the ROK is also considering other measures intended to strengthen the regional medical capacity against COVID-19. Mr. Chair, while I highly appreciate the leadership and effort of the West Africa and Sahel SRSC chambers for its supporting political stability and economic growth in the region, I'd like to ask some questions to him regarding worsening violent extremism in the region. Growing terrorism-related activities will hamper peace-building effort and much needed effective response to COVID-19. What is your view of current situation and future outlook of this regional terrorism? What are the best measures to be taken to address the security instability in the region? Mr. President, I would like to take this opportunity to highlight one last key point. While the COVID-19 is casting a shadow on the regional economic situation, the PBC must continue to play its advisory role to prevent any setback of the UNISS in the situation of COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to the UK, United Kingdom. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First, I'd like to join everyone else in thanking the briefers for the information they gave us today. I think we share many of the concerns that other delegations have expressed this morning, particularly the potential impact on electoral processes in the region and broader democratic consolidation, the risk that it presents to ongoing peace processes like the peace process in Mali in particular. And I've also been very struck by the challenges of prioritization that many delegations, particularly from the region, have expressed today. You know, how do you fight COVID at the same time that you tackle terrorists that are trying to exploit the situation or threaten or other threats to peace and security in the region? I just have three brief points I would like to make. The first is that obviously this is an emergency situation, and the response should obviously focus on the emergency needs of the countries in the region. This means collective support to a coordinated international global health and humanitarian response. As SRSG Chamba said, it's vital that we have international solidarity at this moment. The UK is playing its part in that, and we've so far contributed over $900 million to the global COVID response. And we're working with partners, particularly countries in the region, to adapt our existing programs in West Africa and the Sahel and we've extended the UK's $70 million social safety net support to prepare for economic shocks to the region. We're also working closely with the World Bank, the IMF and the African Development Bank to ensure that the countries in West Africa and the Sahel are supported. My second point is that in West Africa and the Sahel in particular, but it's also true more broadly, it's vital that our response to the pandemic must be integrated with efforts to address underlying causes of stability. As the PR of Brazil and many others have said, this can't just be about the short term, we have to think about the medium and long term as well. This means that the global health response, the humanitarian response, the economic response, and the political response must consider potentially destabilizing factors, including the needs of the marginalized, broader risks to government and the social contracts. To do that, it's vital that we build some capacity for kind of conflict and fragility risk identification into all of our national, regional, and international response mechanisms. The third and final point I want to make is that in the West Africa region in particular, local level peacebuilding initiatives will play a critical role in working to ensure stability. So I'd like to take this opportunity to encourage the UN, regional actors, donors, governments of the region and affected communities to work closely with civil society and those with reach into the field. Global responses are absolutely critical at this moment, but the best solutions will always begin locally with the grassroots movements and women's organisations that represent the most vulnerable and exposed people in this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll go to Peru now. Peru, you have the floor.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you very much, Marc-André. We want to welcome the celebration of this meeting and thanks to the important presentations of the distinguished briefers who have agreed to recognize the crucial and differentiated role that the PBC is called to play in West Africa and the Sahel in this current delicate scenario. I would like to take this opportunity to refer to the 3 guideline questions included in the concept note. Regarding the first one, we note that while cross-border transhumance has always existed in the Sahel, a series of factors have led to an increase in transhumance-related conflicts. First, the diminishing in natural resources and arable land due to climate change. Second, additional pressure due to demographic issues, such as increase in population. And third, the surge of terrorist and violent groups, as well as weapons proliferation. In that context, and as countries are increasingly restricting movement across borders to contain the COVID-19 outbreak, we consider it important that PBC conduct deep assessment of the impact of such measures in order to prevent them to become a new fueling factor for transhumance-related conflicts. Additionally, the role of PBC will be vital in the upcoming electoral processes in the region. It is crucial in the complex current circumstances that PBC supports the efforts that aim to avoid the postponement of these electoral processes, or in any case, that said postponement to be for the shortest possible time. We also stress the crucial activities that PBC and Peacebuilding Fund conduct in support of UNOWAS in order to help address governance and justice gaps, poverty, exclusion, and combat the root causes of conflict. Regarding the second question, peacebuilding and development are interrelated. While there is an urgent need to increase the response of previously vulnerable public health systems, additional resources will be needed to stimulate economies and regenerate jobs back to pre-crisis levels. For example, the IMF recently approved a 39-month extended credit facility for the Gambia in the amount of $47 million. This program will help to maintain momentum for delivering key commitments of the National Development Plan 2018-2021. Similar measures are needed for all the countries in the West Africa in the Sahel. Regarding the third question, the partnership between IOM, the Gambia Ministry of Health, and the Gambia Red Cross Society for a COVID-19 sensitization campaign offers a good example. This campaign is training volunteers to engage with influential figures in the border communities with Senegal to raise awareness on COVID-19 in order both to minimize the spread as well as to prevent the stigma and discrimination. We underscore that such efforts require finances between developed countries and international financial institutions. I want to thank you, Mr. President, for your strong leadership in the current complex circumstances. I wish you all be safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, very much appreciated. And now I'll go to the representative of Dominican Republic.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for convening this meeting. As the Ambassador Sweden has mentioned, it's the most pressing concern for all countries of the world right now, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's important to look at the potential devastating impact in conflict-affected regions like the West Africa and the Sahel. Likewise, our appreciation to SRSD Chambers and head of ECOWAS, and as well as to USG Oscar Fernandez for providing us with updates. The same thing for members of UNOWAS for being able to give us a sense of the priorities in this respect in the region. As we witness how the pandemic is sweeping through all countries, especially middle and high income countries, with more than 2.4 million people infected and 170,000 deaths worldwide. The biggest challenge facing peace-building efforts in all regions, especially in West Africa and the Sahel, is to consolidate gains obtained so far to bring sustainable peace as well as those economic and developmental gains, which requires keeping us with current efforts while at the same time supporting countries in their fight to contain the pandemic. Easier said than done. The pandemic comes at a very critical time for the region, resulting from opposite trends. On one hand, elements for optimism, like peaceful democratic transition processes in several countries of the region, as is the case of Mali, progress in the implementation of the Agreement for Peace and Reconciliation in Mali, as well as government actions regarding the situation in the center of the country. And on the other hand, great challenges remain, such as those related to climate change and those pertaining to food security, but also those on the security front, which ever more alarming fatal cases of intercommunal violence and terrorist attacks, resulting in the loss of hundreds of lives, both civilians and armed forces. Adopting peace-building resources and strategies to support countries in West Africa and the Sahel in dealing with the pandemic will depend heavily on enhanced regional and international coordination and contributions with UNOWAS, ECOWAS, and others, while continuing playing key roles and building on previous experiences such as the Ebola outbreak. We're glad to hear from USG Oscar Fernandez that $137 million will be provided, has been approved to support the Sahel and the Lake region, the Lake Chad region. Therefore, based on an integrated UN approach, building on projects supported by the UN, supporting the response on COVID-19, by the UN Peacebuilding Fund, it is important that while programs and projects are and will be aiming at supporting the response of the pandemic, this should not be, and other efforts be addressed in silence, but as part of existing ones, such as the ones on cross-borders, dialogue of peace agreements, the reestablishment of basic services, empowerment of women and youth, and the strengthening of local capacity for conflict prevention, or the recent approved project in Mali by PBSO, focused on providing an integrated response to the questions of impunity for human rights violations and abuses. In that vein, an issue we also wish to bring to your attention amid the pandemic is the concern for an increase in gender-based violence and limited capabilities to support victims, while at the same time we urge to continue fostering inclusion and the promotion of the empowerment and participation of women and young people in peace-building efforts, including in the design and the implementation of the strategies with respect to COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now go to France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much for convening this meeting. I think, like all of you, France is deeply concerned by the propagation of the COVID-19 pandemic in West Africa and the Sahel, and only a coordinated response at all levels can address this challenge. We reiterate in that regard the key role of the World Health Organization in coordinating the health response in close cooperation with the UN system under the leadership of the SG. As I speak, the Security Council is also making progress in its response. France is convinced that we need to respond ambitiously. So it's a good thing we have reached an agreement on a debt service suspension initiative for the poorest countries. For France, this will represent 1 billion euros. We also need ambitious development programs to support health systems. And in this regard, we have pledged a significant response of 1.2 billion euros through the French Development Agency. We also reiterate our support to the call of the Secretary General for an immediate and global ceasefire and a safe and unhindered humanitarian access to facilitate the response to the pandemic. In the past years, West African countries have made significant progress in human development and consolidation of democracy. And we must not allow the current pandemic to reverse this progress. As I speak, we are concerned with the situation in Guinea. France is implementing several programs to help Guinea fight against the COVID-19. However, the political situation there concerns us. The legislative election and referendum on 22nd March were neither inclusive nor credible, and it is crucial that steps are taken to resume dialogue between all political stakeholders there. France supports the initiatives from ECOWAS, AU, the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, and the United Nations to this end. Finally, a note on Mali and the Sahel. Despite many challenges, legislative elections were held last Sunday in Mali, and we hope that these elections will be followed by new steps in the implementation of the peace agreement, where several progress have been made in the past months. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, and as the PRs of African countries have rightly pointed out today, terrorists are not stopping their activities, but they are rather increasing them. So the post-summit held in France in January and the establishment of a coalition for the Sahel have reaffirmed France and the G5 Sahel countries' determination to fight against terrorism. So that's a good thing. We also think that MINUSMA has maintained its essential activities through the COVID-19 pandemic, and we encourage the mission to continue to deliver upon its mandate. I thank you. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci. So I will just, I will forego my national right of comments just to accelerate. And I would like to have, if I don't know if Dr. Chambas is still on the line, because I would like Dr. Chambas to react to what was said. And rather than doing my national statement, after Dr. Chambas have talked and Oscar, I would probably make a few comments because I'm trying to put the comments in some buckets to try to help us in our future work. So I just wanted to try something on you. So that's how I would do the closing of the thing. So Dr. Chambas, are you still with us?
Yes, indeed, I am. And by way of reaction, I mean, this has been so exhaustive and quite frankly, the presentations have had so much content, all of them very pertinent and relevant, that I'm challenged to respond to the many issues that were raised. But there was one direct question on the growing violent extremism in the Sahel and the Chad Basin, which is true. It's evident in the heightened activities of Boko Haram and the Islamic State in Greater Sahara and Islamic State West Africa province. Just to underscore again that we are talking about some of the most vicious, heartless, violent extremists, terrorist groups today, anywhere in the world. And they have completely turned ignored the call by the Secretary General for holding of fire, cessation of hostilities during this period of the pandemic, and indeed are trying to take advantage. Of course, there has been strong responses on the part of Sahel countries, and also on the part in particular of Chad, which has embarked on a very strong operation against Boko Haram in particular, after it callously murdered nearly 100 Chadian troops. So what to do is to strengthen the efforts underway by the international community to give muscle to the G5 Sahel force. That is a process underway following consultations which were held in Po and subsequent efforts to enlarging the international coalition and support for the G5 Sahel force. I think that should be pursued, and we hope that the international community can give that force the wherewithal to be able in Central Sahel region, the Nitako-Gruma area, to take on frontally Islamic State, West Africa Province, Islamic State, Greater Sahel. And against Boko Haram, the efforts of Chad are appreciated. The cleaning out of many of the islands in the lake. And we see that Nigeria has also stepped up. In Borno, the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces has relocated to Maiduguri. This is a good sign that all effort is being made to sustain this effort against Boko Haram. And similarly, in the Difa side, we see that Niger is also scaling up. So in the context of the multinational joint task force, I think support is needed to also strengthen it so that we maintain this new momentum against Boko Haram and try to really flush it out of the Lake Chad Basin area. So I think that's an important point to make. Now, coming back to the electoral calendar, we see good faith efforts in the region to, as much as possible, keep to the calendar and engaging in dialogue with all the political parties. A good example was cited by Ambassador Burkina Faso, where the president has invited all the parties. They had one meeting last week. There was supposed to be a follow-up meeting that has been postponed. That is a process that we will continue to be very much interested in. And I can assure you that my colleague, President of ECOWAS Commission, Mr. Brew, and I, working as always, ECOWAS, and us hand in hand, will support these efforts. Similarly, in Cote d'Ivoire, there are efforts to reach out and build a consensus. And only yesterday, I think the Prime Minister made it very clear that every effort is going to be made to hold the elections on schedule. And if not, there are constitutional provisions anyway that address a situation where elections are not held on time. So in all of this context, I think that as always, ECOWAS, we will, us will work hand in glove to foster dialogue, genuine, inclusive dialogue. Because let's be clear, we cannot afford a political crisis on top of these multi-dimensional crises already triggered by COVID-19 pandemic. So we must do everything to maintain constitutional legality, constitutional order, and this will go a long way to help us to maintain stability in the region. Now, there was also an issue about humanitarian corridors, which was raised by Ambassador Fatima of the AU. And I should inform here that the World Food Program and the WHO have embarked on an initiative to set up actually global hubs, but also regional hubs. And this includes hubs in Addis Ababa, in Johannesburg, and in Accra to facilitate quick movement of medical and other supplies into depots and to be able to provide sufficient quantities for African countries in this context of the regional depots, but also, very importantly, movement of humanitarian workers. In spite of the crisis, we should facilitate movement of humanitarian workers so that they are on the ground to respond to urgent needs, especially of IDP communities, particularly women and children who are in these camps. And as it emerged, I mean, the region is now hosting nearly 1 million IDPs, and that's a huge number. We must be mindful about this particular vulnerable community at a time like this. So I think these are the issues that I would like to respond to. Mr. Ambassador, once again, thank you and your colleagues for this opportunity to participate in this briefing session. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chambas. Thanks for very insightful comments. And Oscar, do you want to say a few words?
Très peu, merci. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Again, just on the question that was raised, we are working very proactively with WHO, particularly in reinforcing the government's crisis response mechanisms as it relates not just to communication, but to deployment and use of community infrastructures to complement the health state mechanisms, particularly, as I was saying earlier, in border areas. SRSG Chambas was just referring to one of the epicenters of insecurity in the Sahel, which is the tri-state border area between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the Liptako-Gourma region as it's known. And this is a particular focus of our attention to ensure that ongoing activities are not interrupted. So there's a quest to ensure that the gains that have been taken place continue. And as SRSG Chambas was saying, this is an area that is now seeing an increase in violence, precisely as if you will, as opportunistic measure around the distraction that COVID-19 is creating to some extent. Just let me end, because the issue of humanitarian corridors and the issue of cross-border dynamics has come up in so many of the interventions. Just to recall that David Beasley, in his briefing to the Security Council yesterday, was making an impassioned plea to ensure that that both humanitarian goods and commercial trade continue to flow across borders, precisely because they are the lifeline of global food systems as well as the global economy. And these supply chains need to keep moving if we are to overcome the pandemic and get food from where it is produced to where it is needed. So again, I think that maybe in future deliberations, as we saw in the Ebola response, how important deconflicting or agreeing on what type of cross-border exchanges needs to happen will be quite crucial also in how we're able to address security, socioeconomic, peace building, and health and other issues of border communities that, as we've seen in many previous PBC discussions, are a particular focus of attention from the Peacebuilding Fund and this particular commission. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Oscar. And in closing, I'll try something that is very, very dangerous to do, which is actually, but the people who work with me are used to me trying to put things in buckets and buckets of work and stuff. So just to provoke all of you, but unfortunately, none of you can reply to me right now. You can do it privately, but you won't have, I won't give you I think we have to close the meeting because we're getting to the end, but and I just want to provoke things. And this is just to organize what I focused on the countries from the region, and I've focused on Dr. Chambas and Oscar and others, but all of the PRs who talk from the region, and I've tried to put some kind of space of how could we divide the topics and some of them, and for future work, or just to think about how we do it, even in other forum. I'm thinking about maybe Mona through the ECOSOC, or any group of friends that exist out there, and all of that, where to try to be helpful to the region, how we could think about that. So I'll just start, and they're not in the right order at all. So between number one, and I have, bear with me, it's going to be short. It's 8 buckets, I think, but I just want to describe them. So I think that the first one is the security issue. The fact that Dr. Chambas mentioned it, and many mentioned it, Barry and others mentioned the issue of security and violent extremism, and the issue of the entire situation pre-COVID that existed in the region is still there and could be exacerbated. That's one area. The second area to me is the political and / governance area. The ability to manage the crisis from a public governance, but also the elections that are coming. So that's the second one. The third one, many people talked about the importance of acting at the local level, at the community level, and that it's so key. And I'm not so sure about what to do with that, but I've put that in a bucket by itself, where we could think about how we go after that. The fourth one is, I think, women and girls and children. I think everybody has been pointing. I mean, Dr. Chambas, Abari, and Ambassador Samson from Nigeria have been pointing about the women and girls that are the most vulnerable in this crisis and disproportionately affected. And the fifth, to me, it's what Abari and Eric from Burkina Faso, and Sheikh from Senegal, and Dr. Chambers and many have talked about, the issue of fighting COVID, the resources needed to fight COVID in the region, including the humanitarian assistance. 6, to me, you won't be surprised to hear that from me, but when I listened to Dr. Chambers, who talked about the business continuity was key, and in essential areas, and Leone, who from Ivory Coast, who said that we need to fight poverty and unemployment, and Lang from Gambia, who said we need to support households, and Ambassador Sanson from Nigeria said, that youth represents the biggest danger, but also the biggest opportunity. I think there's a big bucket there about the economic. We've answered Ebola before, but Ebola was not so much an economic crisis. Yes, it became an economic crisis in some areas because it cut the regions from other parts of the world, that I get, but it was not as acute as what we're going to have now. And we need to find a way to think about this within the UN system, how we're going to deal with the issue of unemployment, and how can we assist the you don't want to come out of it and there's no private sector and everything has crumbled. The SME side, ensure that they are there for the immediate recovery. And we need to think about that as a multilateral system. And I submit to you, we haven't thought about that a lot in the past. And the 7th part is related to that. It's the food security and the supply chain. This is very dear for Canada. Italy and Egypt and Brazil and Canada, we had this meeting on food security that we convened you last weekend, last Friday, and now supply chain. And 8 is actually Tima, who came with the stimulus package, and I've talked about the efforts of President Ramaphosa. We need to talk about that. The West, the North, we all have created our stimulus packages, and how are we going to work all together to make sure, if the recipe was good for the North, it must be good for the South as well. So how are we going to work together to make something like that happen? This is a huge issue. the stimulus. Of course, it started with the debt relief. The debt relief, Canada as being a big part in the G7 and in the G20 and the IMF and the World Bank to argue for this, for the for African countries and small island states and emerging and these developing countries and developing countries. But that's going to be, it's a small part. So we've freed some fiscal space there for a few months or a year or whatever. But we need to think what has been given in developed economy or put together that. So we need to think about, can we put the world together to go there? And that's, I think, is part of the work we have in front of us as the UN, not necessarily about as the Peacebuilding Commission, but that's how I saw the bucket. So that was my attempt at putting the topics in buckets. I'm sure I forgot some, but I wanted to provoke a little bit and to actually influence the people who will make a summary of that meeting. And because I think it's only, these discussions are only useful if we can use them whether in this forum or other forum. So I want to thank you all for being with us, and thanks Dr. Chambas, and thanks Oscar, thanks all of especially the colleagues from the region. Leone, thank you for joining us. You made a special appearance at the Peacebuilding Commission for us, and we thank you. And I thank all of the other briefers from the regions and the PRs from the region, and also all of the others who commented. And it was a very rich discussion. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson.
Thank you, Ali. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Stay safe. Be well.
Same to you, all of you. Thank